I'm Victoria Jashov. I'm the manager of the center. And I would like to say thanks to everyone who participated, both as speakers and as observers and question askers in our inaugural symposium. Also thanks to ARC for use of this beautiful space and the amazing CC staff for all their hard work. Thank you. And to our director, Barty Sanyal, for her vision in bringing this symposium together. It's now my immense pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the day. Ronald Rael is the chair of the Department of Art Practice. He's also professor of architecture at the College of Environmental Design. But beyond his academic titles, he is an artist, a builder, a historian, and a documentarian of spaces and histories, whose work invites us to reimagine what borders have meant and can mean. Born into a family who's lived for generations on the borderlands of what was once Mexico and is now southern Colorado, much of his work has to do with the history of that specific geographical location and its people. Rael's work is instantly recognizable, from his reimagining of a yellow traffic sign depicting the silhouette of a migrant family below the word reunite, to his iconic pink seesaw project at the US-Mexico border that Miriam mentioned. His work has been widely seen in the New York Times, at film festivals throughout the country, and on social media. I highly recommend his Instagram account at Rael, as well as his TED Talk, which, if you haven't seen it, brings together the poignant and the playful in 11 illuminating minutes. He's the author of Border Wall as Architecture, a manifesto for the US-Mexico boundary, and Earth Architecture, a history of building with Earth in the modern era. Rael Sanfratello, the studio he co-founded with architect Virginia Sanfratello, was named a 2014 Emerging Voice by the Architectural League of New York, one of the most coveted awards in North American architecture. Rael Sanfratello's teeter-totter wall, 3 pink seesaws on the US-Mexico border, was named the 2020 Beasley Design of the Year, and a film about the project was featured in the New York Times, which you should all watch if you haven't watched it. In the opening of the documentary film Borderlands, Rael asks the question, isn't it so fascinating that the simple act of drawing a line on a map can transform the way we see and experience the world? Fascinating indeed. We're so grateful for Ronald Rael for inviting us to explore new ways of seeing and experiencing. And now please welcome Professor Ronald Rael.
Thank you, Victoria. That was a lovely introduction. I'm going to share with you what I call notes from the extended Borderlands. That begins with this sign that I found alongside the Borderlands, the contemporary Borderlands, which says, "Las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une." And in thinking about the expansion of what the Borderlands are, it also has to do with its definition. La tierra nos une, the land unites us, but the borders divide us. Tierra also means the earth, the dirt, the ground can unite us as well. And so I want to think about that very sign and think about how borders also divide us, and to think about this expanded definition, because we can think about how borders might be a space that divides 2 things. But I like to also think about it as a border is a thing that unites 2 things as well. And I think depending on a relationship to the borders, we can take on those definitions of the border being a zone of separation or a zone of unity. Unity in terms of the things that come together, countries, languages, cuisines, religions, ideologies. And it's interesting to me to think about how those forms of unity come together in beautiful ways sometimes in ridiculous ways, and sometimes very violent ways. And I think that's a way to think about how we define the border, made very evident by the early 1900s photograph from National Geographic that I think embodies these ideas of violence and ridiculousness, of separation and unity, in this photograph for National Geographic that's entirely staged. It's entirely set up. But other ways that I like to think about the border in terms of where is the border and when is the border, and to think about that border in terms of geography and geology and time. And as Victoria mentioned, my creative practice and my ancestral homeland is a very particular place in the United States, defined by that small little odd-shaped oval that spans the border between Colorado and New Mexico. The oval itself is defined by a border of 13,000 to 14,000 foot mountains. That place is called Valle de San Luis. And at one time, it was the northernmost territory of Mexico, and earlier of the Spanish Empire, and earlier, of course, indigenous land, the home of the Ute, the Kiowa, the Pueblo people. And so it's also the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, which today defines the contemporary border from El Paso till it exits into the Gulf between the United States and Mexico. And so much of my practice, which I'm going to share with you several projects today, has to do with thinking about the when and where of the borderlands in relationship to three particular topics: the militarization of the border, child separation, and labor and enslavement. When I talk about militarization, I want to first talk about the historic US-Mexico border, particularly in Colorado. And there are a number of military forts in Colorado that define that militarization that took place along that border. And they exist in the form of museums today that you can visit, and there's dioramas, and they span throughout on both sides of that border. But these were also sites of child separation, and they were also sites of violence, and they were sites of enslavement. And interestingly enough, they take on the language and architectural technology of the traditional building practices of the region. So they learn from the indigenous building practices of building with the earth as spaces were coming together, and again, in violent ways, in ridiculous ways, in beautiful ways. In this building was 10,000 years old, just across that border in Taos, New Mexico, Taos, Pueblo. But I'd like to remind everyone that the legacy of borders continues. They are like scars that remain in the landscape, and they remain in the minds of people through their traumas, through their beauties, through their stories. And so in Colorado, the legacy of the borderland remains in our language, in our food, in our culture, in our evolving ideologies, and in the traumas. So even in 1936, then Governor Edwin Johnson imposed martial law in the state of Colorado and dispatched the Army National Guard in the form of Border Patrol agents to the New Mexico-Colorado border to prevent people of indigenous and Hispanic heritage from entering the state. This lasted a very short amount of time, just a few days. He was doing that as a part to bolster his campaign in the re-election run for governor. But it's kind of in that particular borderlands. I know people who wake up in the morning in Colorado and go to the bathroom in New Mexico because their house actually showed on that border. And that kind of memory and that legacy existed most recently when the leader of the previous regime announced that they were actively building walls in Colorado. And everyone was confused about where exactly were they building walls in Colorado. And there's this map drawn of a place where that might be happening. It was mentioned that I'm an architecture professor, and I'm very interested in the legacy of architecture in that landscape. And I've been working on a project called the Adobe Archipelago, where I'm actively restoring and telling the stories connected to about 13 Adobe buildings in that landscape. Some of them very connected to me, my own ancestral homes and great-grandparents' homes, but I use them as laboratories for teaching indigenous and traditional building practices. And I use them as sites of healing, particularly in this one building, which is a Ute Indian agency. And I don't know if people know what an Indian agency was, but there were buildings that were built throughout the country, and they were sort of like embassies, we might think of, embassies between the United States government and Native American tribes. But in these agencies, these were sites where Native American treaties were negotiated, or we might say they were forced. And in this particular Indian agency, which is a Tabawacha Ute Indian agency in southern Colorado, it was also a site where during the Civil War, there was a demand to document all slavery that was taking place in the region. In this particular region, there was not African-American slavery, but there was indigenous slavery that had been practiced for centuries. And this is after the Mexican-American War. And in this building, these lists of indigenous slaves were documented, and they exist today in the National Archives. But what's very interesting about these lists is that they were also a census of Native American children who were separated from their families and sold into local families as servants. And so if we look closely at the list, we see their ages 3, 5, 7, 18, 4, 8, 5, 25. It lists the tribe they came from, who bought them, their new baptized name, and the location of their purchase. And one interesting question here: would you return to the place where you were taken from? And everyone said no. You can imagine what a 2-year-old might say, you have no idea. The only two that answered, actually the only one on this list that answered yes is 35 years old. Like, yeah, I want to get back. But I try to tell these stories and reveal these lost histories, and to attempt to do it through history, but also art. And so in this project, I invited the paste-up graffiti artist Chip Thomas. Chip is a really interesting individual who has his own relationship to slavery, but also is a medical doctor who practices on the Navajo reservation. And so he used these lists and pasted them up both inside the building and outside of the building to tell the story of this forgotten legacy in the Borderlands. I'm also working with the group NativeBoundUnbound.org, if you want to visit them. We're making a global archive of the ancestors of those who were related to indigenous slavery. And so in the contemporary Borderlands, we see child separation today. During the time that child separation was in the news every day, during the time of the leader of the previous regime was separating children from their families, I wanted to create a series of signs, protest signs, to protest this practice. And building upon this sign, which so many people have built upon because of its iconicity in the Borderlands today. If you don't know the story of this sign, it has a history in the Borderlands. It was designed by the Diné graphic designer, John Hood, who worked for the California Department of Transportation. And what's so incredible to me about this sign is it's not just a sign to warn motorists of immigrants who have been dropped off alongside the road in human trafficking events, and they may run across the road, and to warn motorists, but he smuggles in forms of activism. The most apparent one is the use of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez as the head of the father, because for Hood, he saw the plight of the immigrant today related to that of the Navajo during the Long Walk, when they were forcibly displaced from their homelands, and during a time when children in that tribe were separated from their families. And so in response, I made a very simple move, which was to turn the family to face each other and to use reunite instead of caution. And I made this open source and available for people around the world to download. People did, in fact, begin to download it. Made a series of large-scale signs with the intention to bring them to the highway and to bring attention to this issue. It caught attention of the Four Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art campaign in the world, and they invited me to bring it to the highway in a very special way, which is in the form of this enormous digital billboard for hundreds of thousands of people to see. You can still see this sign today, which I don't know how long it's going to be there, but it's been there for many, many years at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on 110th and Amsterdam, Manhattan. A number of other places where people are actively downloading and putting it up in their cities, even to this day. But this connection back to the earth is something that I've been interested in for a very long time, because I grew up in buildings made of mud, and I mentioned that I teach these practices, and I think about how we might be able to bring communities together around these practices that are beginning to be lost because of new forms of building code regulations that exclude these traditional forms of building. So 13 years ago, I was asked to design a space for the oldest church in Colorado that formed at that time after the Mexican-American War, during the same era of the creation of this Indian agency for the community that are the ancestors of these children on the list. And so I designed this particular labyrinth for people to take spiritual inward journeys within the labyrinth. It's not quite finished, but the community came together and made 40,000 adobe bricks, mud bricks, to build this monumental space of reflection and gathering. And I also work on much more humble projects that have taken on forms of activism as well, teaching people how to, teaching people traditional cooking techniques, indigenous cooking techniques and practices and technologies in the form of these hornos and oven technology that migrated to the Americas 400 years ago from Europe, along with colonization. So I teach people how to make these, but they have become vehicles and passports for storytelling. One of the more interesting places that I've constructed one of these hornos out of bricks taken from an abandoned Mexican-American schoolhouse in Colorado was on a very small, privately owned peninsula of the land that embedded itself into the center of Trump Winery in Virginia. And this is that, it's called the Truth Horno. And so when you are in the tasting room sipping on a delicious glass of Trump wine, you look down and you see the horno over there, but these tables were built and made by the artist Ana Teresa Fernandez, who painted the wall blue in Erasing the Border project, as a form of resistance and activism, and also to bring the communities who work in those fields and the surrounding community together around stories of truth. I'm also working with the American Refugee Committee to think about how these ovens can be placed in refugee camps and migrant shelters as forms of gathering of very fast cooking technologies and ways to connect to many of the residents of these shelters' traditional cooking practices. And so here at Berkeley, I designed this inflatable formwork and an inflatable horno around which we can pack mud. And you can see it. So you want to see it. It's in the art and anthropology building courtyard in the back, or the welding facilities, but testing this idea of rapidly deployable cooking technologies. And in a course I taught with an anthropology professor and an art professor, brought together communities from indigenous Northern California communities together to share their stories. And finally, in the documentary film Pedacito de la Tierra, which translates to a little piece of earth, but in English, a little piece of home is how it was translated. I have been building these hornos in migrant shelters to improve hospitality. I appreciate the use of that word. I appreciate the critique of that word, but also in this case, like really improving the hospitality in these shelters, because they're inviting people into these shelters. And so building these hornos not only to be a technology to aid in cooking, but really to form community, because in these migrant shelters, there are people from all over the world who speak different languages, have different cooking traditions, but there's always a relationship to fire, to warmth, to gathering, and it's around these hornos that communities are formed, given the diversity of people who are in the shelters and who are trapped there for a very long time. And beautifully, this particular horno, which is quite large, they have been cooking so much bread, like thousands of loaves a week, that they can feed the shelter, but also outside of their shelter as well. When I was at the border one year, the leader of the previous regime announced that there were a lot of bad hombres at the border. And I thought that's really interesting. He didn't say there are bad hombres at the border, which hombre means man. He said there's bad hombres. And as someone who is in the creative field, I thought, well, that's so sophisticated. We think about how he understands this gradient in cultures and the distinctions. And so I thought it was inspirational to bring two other technologies together, the technology of clay and the technology of additive manufacturing, which is something that I'm very interested in. So I made these series of what I call bad hombres made out of clay from the Republican state of Georgia at that time, or maybe now, and the Democratic state of California. I don't know if that's true, but and we can see the gradients and distinctions in the individuals of the objects. If we look closer, again, we can see these distinctions of color and texture and surface. Just this year, these were now collected into the Renwick Smithsonian Permanent Collection, these bad hombres, and now there are bad hombres in the Smithsonian. But it inspired a project to think about how additive manufacturing might be able to just use the earth to make things, to make objects in the world, to make buildings like I have been practicing with. And so I collaborated with the University of Texas, El Paso's ceramics department and geology department in a project to think about how we can actually use clays from Mexico and the United States to make a series of objects using additive manufacturing, and invited 25 ceramic artists from both countries to journey with us on a journey of clay through history and time and place. And I developed this little online app, which is now used in universities all over the world, in high schools and colleges, but enables potters to design those weird kind of bad hombres that I just showed you. But we collected this amazing complexion of clays along the border from Juarez and El Paso, from whites to browns to even greens. And those 25 potters were given the opportunity to make one pot using the software and the materials we had. They got so into it, they actually made 250 of these objects in the course of the exhibition. And the ambitions were to think about also, how could we print architecture? How could we use the soil of the borderlands to make much larger objects, or possibly even spaces? And so for the last 6 years or so, I've embarked on this project of collaborating with an industry partner to think about how we can make maybe many objects. Invented this little machine with them, but that it could make much larger objects as well. And to think about how we can take the clays from the borderlands and use them to build with using robotics. It's a project that I call Mud Frontiers because it explores the frontier of mud in actually the former frontiers of the United States and Mexico. And so the year before the pandemic, embarked upon, for the first time in the world, having the confidence to 3D print the soil of the borderlands to make functional pottery, and embark on maybe making functional buildings as well. And so you can see how this process works. It's simply taking mud from the landscape, as it has been for 10,000 years on our planet, and squeezing it through this hose like a tube of toothpaste and depositing it to make, in this case, multi-cellular structures. Is during the pandemic, actually, that spent the largest amount of time there in the borderlands of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico to begin this project, which I called Casa Bovida. And that's not a real word, Bovida. It kind of sounds like COVID, but it also is Covida. Like it's a house for cohabitation during the time of COVID, and it's a house for two people. A speculative house, a speculative form of architecture in the borderlands that thinks about indigenous and traditional building materials coupled with the hybridity of robotic technology, building it also with friends from Taos Pueblo who made these beautiful textiles using churro wool, with this in a space for sleeping, a space for cooking and relaxing, using pottery that was printed in the very same way, using techniques and materials that were taught to us by that young man there in the front, who's actually a very well-known chef from Taos Pueblo, Johnny Ortiz, and a space for bathing, and just challenging the notions of what what is technology? What is advanced technology? I like to think that Earth is the most advanced technology on the planet because we've been working on it for 10,000 years, and robots have only been around for a short amount of time relative to the human experience, and so they break all the time. They don't work well, and so it's the most primitive technology we have for building. And all my architecture colleagues are like, that's not a building, it doesn't have a roof. But what would a roof be like in the borderlands? If you live in the borderlands, especially on the contemporary US-Mexico border, you're always looking up at inflatable objects. You know, there are all these aerostat blimps that look down on you and survey the land constantly. So we made this much less foreboding inflatable roof that imparted this beautiful tint into the space that was much more like a cherry on top of the chocolate sundae. And most recently this summer, invited to build a large-scale installation of the not so coincidentally named Frontier Drive-In, which is right on the frontier of the former US-Mexico borderlands, where Professor Michael Deere, I don't know if you know him, who wrote Why Walls Won't Work, and I hosted a Borderlands Film Festival at this drive-in, which is in this Borderlands context of hyper agriculture that sucks water out of the deep aquifer in the Colorado landscape to grow barley and wheat for Coors beer that's stored in these kind of silos. So I wanted to make a skylo instead that helped the sky. This is a dark sky area. It's for viewing stars and clouds and just a few vignettes of what the skylos look like under construction, just to give you a sense of how this very mobile, inexpensive robot is right there working right there, can construct these large scale structures. It's in a lot of ways, it's building with a robot is like a border patrol job. There's not much to do unless something bad happens. And so everybody's just standing. This is my former graduate research assistant, who's now professor at Georgia Tech, and he was just very relaxed, looking around, a little bit of massaging of the clay. But thinking about these spaces, places where people who are migrating, visiting the desert landscape, come together surrounded by Earth. It was mentioned that I was the author of a book called Border Walls Architecture, that is what I call a biography of the border wall constructed between the United States and Mexico. It's a book that tells the complex stories of the spaces that the border wall affects, the people and the ecologies that 800 miles of wall has transformed. And in that book, I illustrate many of these stories in the form of what I call recuerdos, or souvenirs, or memories. And I do this in the form of snow globes and postcards and keychains and maps, and there's an ant farm, these kind of souvenirs that allow us to remember the time that we constructed a border wall between the United States and Mexico, and what a crazy idea that was. And one of these recuerdos is called Teeter-Totter Wall. And in 2010, I created this drawing called Teeter-Totter Wall that's drawn onto one of the original surveys of the US-Mexico border, drawn by two engineers, a Mexican engineer and an engineer from the United States, who traveled by horse and mule to define where the border would be and to create that line between Tijuana and El Paso. And so this is that map, and this is the snow globe that considers that the border is a metaphorical fulcrum between inequities of labor and trade and wealth and poverty. And this particular set of drawings and models caught a lot of attention in the public imagination. And so I had wondered if there was a possibility to construct this object as, let's say, an art object or an architectural object. But I went as far as to really consider what it would mean to insert a teeter-totter in the wall, how it would be attached. I even went so far as to carry large objects to the wall on both sides of the border and calculate how long it took for Border Patrol to come and tell me or ask me what I was doing. And then I worked with this really beautiful organization called Colectivo Chopeque in Juarez, who builds houses for those at the fringes of poverty. We worked together to actually construct these teeter-totters in Juarez. This is the first ride of the teeter-totter, testing it out in the welding shop. And this idea of smuggling became very interesting to me, because in the same way John Hood smuggled activism into design in the making of that sign, I wondered how we could smuggle design to the border in the border wall. And so that metaphorical fulcrum became a literal fulcrum in the form of this small little key that attached to this base angle of the border wall that holds all the verticals in a 45-degree angle in position. I want you to remember that for a little bit later in the lecture. We found it very interesting, this idea that the same material, steel, when in the vertical position separated people, but in the horizontal position had the potential to connect people together. Because it's the very same material, we thought, well, should it exist as the same material but in different orientation, or should it stand apart? And we went through several iterations of what that color would be. Colectivo Chopeque and ourselves decided that it should be pink, because we wanted to remember that this was an object of play and uses play as a form of activism in a landscape where pink has a very particular meaning. If you go through Juarez, you recognize these objects, these crosses that remember the femicide that occurred when Juarez was the most violent city on this planet. It was these teeter-totters sat in this welding shop wrapped in plastic for many, many months. There's never any intention to actually use them, even though they're designed to be used. But as there were increased stories of child separation and more wall construction, constantly bombarding us, it was a moment in this country where it felt like we could feel this global pressure of these two issues and how it affected not only our country, but the entire planet, because walls were being divided between everything and everyone, not only countries, but our political identities, our personal identities, our religions. And so one day we simply decided to ask the communities that we've been visiting for 15 years if they wanted to, especially the kids, if they wanted to hang out and have an event with a teeter-totter. And they were all like, that sounds cool. And so we invited families to have an event on the teeter-totter. And this is how that day unfolded. You know, I'm running to the wall and I'm scared to death. And what's in front of me is this enormous serpent. And I suddenly feel like, oh, I'm wielding a weapon that I stabbed this enormous dragon, and you could feel the release, because the moment I inserted through the wall, a kid jumped on, everybody's laughing, everybody's having fun. It was just like an immediate moment where the women, the mothers, the aunts, the grandmothers came together and they created their own space, a sanctuary space that they owned, that they were in control of, because certainly within 8 minutes, Border Patrol did show up and ask what was going on, and we said we're having an event with the families. So they went off to the side and just watched. Very soon after, and unexpectedly, the Army National Guard of Mexico showed up, heavily armed, and asked what the hell we were doing. And the mothers were like, well, we're having an event with families. And so they stood back and smiled and took some pictures. And the event kept going. And then I asked Border Patrol and Army National Guard if they would like to ride together. They said yes. They decided to be very professional. And finally, like with any playground, the children got tired of riding teeter-totter. We never asked permission to do this, and nobody told us to stop. It simply ended that day. And it was through me posting on social media that this particular image traveled across the world. Not only the image, but the meaning of the image, because I think it related to everybody in very different ways. This understanding that we can be united across borders, that there is the opportunity to reimagine those spaces of violence and separation, that we can tell an alternative story, a narrative of the borderlands, but it's not a bad place where nobody lives and bad men are doing bad things, but it's a space where families and children live every day and experience the kind of joys that everyone wants to experience despite the oppression and violence of this world. And then, you know, many weird things unfolded after that. In addition to the amount of press it got around the world, the art world claimed it as theirs, that this event was art. And there was art installation. And I thought that's really interesting. This claim that they said, Victoria, you know, the Beasley Award, which is a very prestigious award. So this is an amazing piece of art. Okay. But one museum in Lisbon invited us to recreate the teeter-totter wall in the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology. And I initially said no. I thought it was very strange to decontextualize this event and place it in a museum. And they kept pressing. And so I got a little bombastic. And I said, I think we need to show the world the violence of this wall, that this wall is not a fence, and that it also has not yet been built, because it has. So I said, can we construct it as tall as it is, with as much steel as is used? Can we even put barbed wire on it? And they said, yes. And I was like, hey, crap. So we reconstructed it. I said, can we cut the museum in half? They had an enormous atrium that they have the exhibition in. Like, imagine the Guggenheim, if you've been in a much, much larger than the Guggenheim. So can we cut it in half? So that visitors have to go all the way around to see the works on both sides. They said, yes. I said, well, I have this vision of the borderlands. I have a vision of a post-borderland world, a post-border wall world, where we take down the wall one day. And what do we do with those billions of dollars, those millions of tons of steel? Can we do something productive with it? Can you allow this exhibition to be a laboratory, an architectural laboratory, where we make a study model for a house using all that material? And they said, yes. And I said, great. So I've been working on this project called the Teeter-Totter House that will be built in Braga, Portugal, in an industrial area where families and communities can come together. The Teeter-Totter House will have an horno, because the horno, as they say it, forno, migrated from Portugal to the Americas 400 some years ago. And just 3 days ago, I got these photographs. So you're seeing them for the first time, the Teeter-Totter House. It's not quite done, it's still under construction, but I'm going there at the end of the month to have a celebration to inaugurate this Teeter-Totter House. And this is just a study model for the future. But I don't know if you remember that immediately when Biden became president, he halted all construction on the wall. And so construction crews went home, and millions of tons of steel were left abandoned alongside the border in Oregon Cactus National Park. And so I decided, would it be possible to smuggle 10,000 pounds of that steel and take it from the wall to construct a architecture of gathering and unity? And so with the help of Arizona State University, was able to smuggle that bottom rail, pile of the bottom rail, 10,000 pounds of it, and construct a pavilion in the gallery that I call Casa Unida. It sort of just unfolds and slowly lifts up to welcome people into the space below. This structure, Casa Unida, is currently on a semi-truck headed towards Nogales, to that shelter where we constructed the order to become a space of spiritual gathering, the roof of the space where underneath will make it a literal space of gathering within that shelter. And so I don't know if it's crossed the border yet, but it's on the way. And so in addition to Casa Unida, There are two galleries in Arizona State ASU Museum. The other side is a project related to the way that the wall divides. And the wall is not a barrier that defines two different sides. It's a wall that defines one landscape. On one side, it might look like this, a person just mowing their lawn in their backyard. And on the other side, it looks like this. It defines the fourth wall of someone's house. In my book, Border Walls Architecture, I tell a story of a very particular condition where the Army Corps of Engineers was simply drawing that line on a map of where the wall needed to go, and they drew it through someone's house. An old man that I just learned 3 days ago, named Mr. Garza. Mr. Garza's house had this line drawn through it. You were literally going to build this border through someone's house, this wall through someone's house. So I drew a series of blueprints that just look at that condition, look at the condition of a wall cutting through a single house. In this case, half of the house, this side, the right side, shows the average size of the house in El Paso, Texas. And the left side, the average size of the house in Juarez, Mexico. You can see the construction detail, the thickness of walls. In this case, the wall cuts through the bed in the bedroom. And so, related to the work Casa Unida, House United, there's also House Divided. In this case, the construction of the house that cut through the bed in the bedroom. And I worked with members of the same group, Colectivo Chopeque, who reformed as the Border Architecture Laboratory in Juarez to reconstruct these spaces of the borderlands and show these worlds that are so close together and simultaneously so far apart. And the objects of those spaces, the memories of those spaces, what is similar and what is different, and it's filled with, if you look closely, speculative moments of. I just want to point out over here this southwestern pottery on the side, that Lastero's cabinet, the drugs on the table, the self-help books, the bicycle. You know, when we talk about this, oh, in Mexico we're gonna have a bicycle, like a workout bike where you hang your clothes on. Everybody in Mexico has that. And everybody says, oh, I said, what do you mean, like that one? I showed him mine in Oakland. But you know, the crucifix, the little pillow that says have a little faith. Like there's just, it's filled with these moments of relationship, and we also used these spaces as a place to bring people together who had been separated. In this case, this particular family, the mother and daughter, had been separated for years until recently we joined together in this house divided. Don't get married for that, did you? On the other side of House Divided, the wall divides the table and the kitchen. It's the little bird cage, the doggy or kitty bowl, the cooking implements, the actual clay pottery that's used, the laptop, the Cheerios on the floor, the wood chips on the floor, just the story of all the things that make us similar and different, that make us so close together and so far apart at the same time. And I'll leave you with a thought that I've just been thinking about. It's a new thought, testing it on you. That has to do with material, has to do with geography and geology and time that I opened with. And thinking about how the very first border, not the frontier, not the frontera, but the moment that the frontier became the border, is when those two gentlemen engineers were walking that line and marking that line. They marked it with a series of cairns, a stack of rocks. Stack of rocks was piled high enough that from your horse at a particular distance, you could see the next stack of rocks. And they did that all the way. And as they were going and marking these rocks, ranchers would go and pick up these rocks and move them and stack them in a different place. And they carried the burden of the border for the first time, making new space for themselves and others. And then other people pick those rocks up and carry them back. And we are constantly in that battle now, moving the materials of the border back and forth. But today, the weight of the border is much heavier. And it's our burden to bear. And so I guess I want everybody in the room just to think about the responsibility, that load that we have to carry, because that border wall is ours. We paid for it. We voted for individuals who approved it. And so now we must carry the load of that wall. And we have the responsibility to pick it up and to open it up to make space for others. So thank you very much.